You know, I've argued for hours and hours and hours sometimes with people who simply can't understand knowing without a knower, because they are so trapped by sentence structure. The verb has to have that subject. Therefore, you can't have a state of affairs in which there is just the verb, that is to say, knowing. They say, well, who is knowing? And it's as bad as arguing with a flat earthist or a Jehovah's Witness. Impossible. Because of the ruts of thought. Now, such a person can never be inventive. Why? Because he will never see a new pattern and a new structure. And he won't see one because he's thinking all the time. He's not open to the variations of the actual world. And so, he can only see what he's been taught to see. That's why academic psychology is always in a position of bafflement about learning theory. Because if learning is a process of converting new experience into the terms of what you've already learned, you never really learn at all. It's like, according to kind of a narrow-minded aerodynamics, bees cannot fly. Well, there's no way of explaining the aerodynamics of that vibration, but it flies. And you often come up against this when an inventor has an idea and all his colleagues say to him, oh, don't be silly. You can't do that. It just wouldn't work. Well, he says, I've tried it and it does work. Or they say, come on. And very often they won't even try. They'll just say it can't be done. You can get a fantastic dogmatism in the scientific world. And you have to be terribly careful not to upset certain absolutely fundamental, strictly prejudices, which are the result of thinking too much and of getting accustomed to the warm ruts of thought. And so you never could see the new. So this is the real meaning of an open mind. Not merely that you're a liberal sort of guy, but that you can turn off thoughts and yes, thus be turned on to reality. Thoughts, you see, belong to the world of symbols. What we experience with our senses is, of course, the physical world, the real world. You may ask me, well, isn't there also a spiritual world? But you must understand that the spiritual world is the same thing as the physical, when the physical is not confused with the symbolic. There is no real difference between the spiritual and the physical. It's all one energy. All in one space. Now, you see, though, the difficulty is that in saying something like it's all one energy, this is really the point. I mean, if you understand that this whole universe is one energy and you're it, you don't really have any much in the way of further problems. I mean, you have a few practical problems, like how to make a good table or a beautiful dress or whatever it is that you're after. But you don't have any more metaphysical problems when you see that. But a person who thinks a lot can't understand that at all. Because he says, well, it doesn't make any difference if everything is all one energy. Let's begin again. I mean, what have you said? Of course we haven't said anything. Logically, the statement is pure nonsense. Everything is one energy. So what? But that's only because the person who has received this communication has had it only as a thought. And as a thought, it's again like saying, there is paper under every word on this page. And thinking that that means that paper, 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 paper. But when this is something that emerges from not thinking, and when you see that you've been bamboozled all your life long, you've been bugged by everybody else into thinking that you're some kind of a freak that came into this world, and you don't really belong here because probably your parents didn't really want you, and certainly your brothers, older brothers and sisters didn't want you around. You were eating up more, and in school they tell you, you've got to learn that you're not the only pebble on the beach, and that therefore the best way of teaching you that is that you're really rather insufferable around here, and you're on probation until you are acceptable. Well, babies then grow up, you see, with this treatment, feeling strangers, feeling that the earth is something alien. And so we all have this feeling of being alone, of being impotent little puppets of a huge system going on. And so we are progressively fooled out of, really with our own cooperation, fooled out of this sense that you can get if you suspend all these identifications that one does with the thinking process. This is this, this is that, I'm me, what's me is different from so on. You suspend that. You see not simply that all those problems and all those definitions of who you are were unreal. There's something else, you see. There's the feeling, beyond having dissipated the illusion, of the sheer joy and delight of this one energy now is realizing itself as you. And how nice that it won't always be doing that, because that would get boring. It'll go like this, you see, and it'll be a different situation altogether. You'll run into a brick wall. Before you know where you are, you're going beep, 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 out of an eggshell. The whole thing is flipped, and you're doing it on another track. But there's only one you see. It's all the one energy. But this is, as I say, difficult to understand logically if you don't understand it experimentally. If you understand it experimentally, it's perfectly clear when somebody says everything is one energy. You say, of course. But the person who's stuck with the concepts and has nothing more than the concept simply can't make any sense of it at all. And he says, well, you're suffering from a hallucination. And we'll proceed to prove, according to his ideas, that what you've achieved in that has made no difference to you or to anything else. Of course, he can prove it, because his proof is set up to give just that result. Well then, I got into that at some length, the question of no thinking, because of trying to point out how one must avoid trying to understand space in such a way as to make it a thing, like a box, you see, which contains all the objects in it. But a no thing, like space, is at the same time in cahoots with things. They are two aspects, two poles, two terms of the same one energy. Don't make space at the same pole of the one energy as the things. It's the opposite pole. It is then because of our treatment of space as nothing, you see, that we are afraid of death. We are afraid of that pole of experience, which is unconsciousness, that corresponds to space surrounding the world. And because we think that reality, that our life, that our identity is entirely in the domain of consciousness and thingness and thinkableness, the other pole seems completely threatening. Whereas, of course, it is that on which it all depends, because the two poles depend on each other. They energize each other. So when you are scared of the non-being side of things, you are, as it were, frightened of your own mother. Now, of course, you may have reason to be, because there are such things as devouring mothers. But the devouring mother represents the original horror felt for the unknown. And in practice, in human relationships, the devouring type of mother is precisely the person who cannot come to terms with her own unknown. Therefore, she wants to control everything. She wants to see that all her children remain perpetually under her dominance. She can't let go. Because if she let go, you know, she'd become uncorseted and flop all over the place, as it were. She becomes the devourer. But you always conquer the devourer by dropping into it. By faith, in other words. Faith in the sense of trust. I don't mean belief, trust. Drop into space and you float. See, this is only begins to be understood by rocket people as they get out there. We're going to have, I don't know how the psychology of this is proceeding, but we're going to have an awful lot of people getting out in space and not wanting to come back. Because when you're in orbit and you float, very interesting sensation. And they have to follow very strict rules, that same way where you do with skin diving. When you get to a certain level of pressure, you start floating and you feel no body weight. And you have to absolutely keep your will going. When the watch says a certain thing, up you go. Orders is orders, you see. Otherwise you drown in great delight and bliss. So the point is, though, that we are at the moment looking at space as something to be entered by the tremendous thrust of a rocket. Because that is the attitude of attacking the unknown. And that causes us not to realize that we are already on the most magnificently equipped spaceship, which could hardly be improved upon. It has got a source of temperature and energy just at the right distance from it. It's beautifully equipped with oxygen, with food supplies, with all kinds of delightful things to do while on the journey. And it's traveling through space at a colossal speed. And it's called the planet Earth. The art of exploring from the planet Earth depends not on conquering space with rockets, bombs, but on developing greater sensitivity in the place where we are. Lao Tzu said, "Without going out of my house, I know the whole universe." So by clumsy beginnings of this sensitivity are seen in radio astronomy, which instead of trying to leap out of the world, it stays here and gets more sensitive. And eventually, I feel that we shall discover each one of us have inside our heads a radio astronomical contraption of great subtlety. And we shall eventually, the more we use instruments, we shall begin to watch a process which I will call etherealization. What at present we call miniaturization is connected with this. Miniaturization means that electronic equipment becomes smaller and smaller and smaller until what was originally a great box like this becomes a tiny, tiny little thing. Little tiny cell. And so in the same way, as certain techniques advance, all kinds of joining lines like wires begin to vanish. See, when radio substitutes for the telephone, all the wires vanish. When the airplane substitutes for road and railway, all the roads and rails are going to vanish. See? And more and more we find means of getting rid of the clumsiness of primitive technology. And then as all this apparatus disappears, we find that we are moving in the direction of having it all in our own apparatus, just like dolphins have sonar, homing pigeons have built-in radar. I think it's all in us, but we had to exteriorize it technologically in order to discover it within. It's curious how, past the middle of the 20th century, there's very strong evidence of a revival in Western philosophy of what used to be called idealism, not in the moral sense, but in the metaphysical sense. That is to say, of the feeling that the external world is in some way the creation of the mind. Only we come to this point of view with very different assumptions than were held by people like Hegel or Berkeley or Bradley, great idealists of the European metaphysical tradition. I'm probably rather more akin to similar trends in Buddhist philosophy, emerging from India about 400 AD. The difference of approach, the difference of the way in which today this thing arises, and the way in which it arose in the thought of a man like Bishop Berkeley, is that the new idealism has a kind of curiously physical basis. When one would argue, everything you know is in your mind, and the distance, the feeling of externality between you and other objects and people is also the content of consciousness. And therefore it's all your consciousness. This of course created all sorts of weird feelings. Are things there when I'm not witnessing them, or Is there anybody else there? Or are you all my personal dream? And one has only to imagine a conference of such people, of solipsists, those who believe that they alone exist, arguing as to which one of them is really there, to make the whole idea rather laughable. And furthermore, there seemed to be no clarity in such philosophical thinking as to what the term mind or consciousness meant. It had long associations with the miasmic and the gaseous by way of images. Mind and soul and spirit were always vague and formless. And matter, by contrast, was very rugged, craggly. And how these two ever influenced each other, nobody ever could decide. Because all properly behaved ghosts walk straight through brick walls without disturbing either the bricks or the ghost. And so how can a mind incarnate in a material body move that body in any way? This was always a puzzle. So people began to think that the differentiation between mind and matter was of no use. Because actually what happens in making such a differentiation is that you impoverish both sides of it. When you try to think of matter as mindless, or mind as immaterial, you get a kind of a mess on both sides. It's the same way when you get a mystic who's not a bit of a sensualist, and a sensualist is no whit of a mystic. Such a sensualist is boring. Such a mystic is a fanatic. Too spiritual. It's the same when we divide the medical profession from the priesthood. Both are losers. Not just because they lose their so-called opposite half. But the problem is when you separate a doctor from a priest, you do more than create a specialization out of what was originally one field. You create two specializations. Because a priest-physician is more than a priest plus a physician. By having, as it were, the binocular vision from medicine and from religion, he just doesn't see two added areas. He sees the area in 3 dimensions as a result of this combination. Well, in a similar way, when we have the concepts of mind and matter working separately, both are impoverished. Mind becomes vague kind of gas, psychic gas, and matter becomes mere stuff. But you see, what has enabled us to make a transition is, first of all, above all, I would say, 2 sciences, biology and neurology. Because through biology, and to some extent physics, the method of physics has shown us that the idea that man can be an objective observer of an external world that is not himself, so that, as it were, he can stand back from it and look at it and say, what is out there? We see that this cannot be done. We can approximately do it, but we cannot really and fully do it for 2 reasons. One, the most important reason, is that the biologist will show us very clearly there is no way of definitively separating a human organism from its external environment. The 2 are a single field of behavior. And then furthermore, to observe something, either simply by looking at it, or more so by making experiments, by doing science on it. You alter what you're looking at. You cannot carry out an observation without in some way interfering with what you observe. It is this that we try when we're watching, say, the habits of birds, to be sure that the birds don't notice us, that we're watching. To watch something, it must not know you're looking. And of course, what you ultimately want to do is to be able to watch yourself without knowing that you're looking. Then you can really catch yourself not on your best behavior and see yourself as you really are. But this can never be done. And likewise, the physicist cannot simultaneously establish the position and the velocity of very minute particles or wavicles. And this in part because the experiment of observing nuclear behavior alters and affects what you're looking at. This is one side of it. The inseparability of man and his world, which deflates the myth of the objective observer, standing aside and observing a world that is merely mechanical, a thing that operates like a machine out there. The second is from the science of neurology, where we understand so clearly now that the kind of world we see is relative to the structure of the sense organ. That, in other words, what used to be called the qualities of the external world, its qualities of weight or color, texture, and so on, are possessed by it only in relation to a perceiving organism. The very structure of our optical system confers light and color upon outside energy. And in this sense then, especially if you want to read a very easily digestible account of this thing, you get the book by J.Z. Young called Doubt and Certainty in Science. But you see here, from a new basis altogether, we have a new answer to the old riddle. If a tree falls in the forest when nobody is listening, does it make a noise? The answer in terms of modern science is perfectly clear. That the falling tree creates vibrations in the air, and these become noise if and only if they relate to an eardrum and to an auditory nervous system. Just as in ordinary drums, however hard you hit, the drum will make no sound if it has no skin. Because sound is not something that exists in the external world. Sound is a relationship between vibrating air and certain kinds of biological organisms. And therefore it is these organisms which confer what we call sound upon a vibration which in an earless world would make no noise. Now you see, that is perfectly clear and straightforward. But now we can dare we take certain steps from that. Could we say, for example, that before any organisms existed, there was no world? And what we're talking about when we talk about a world prior to the existence of organisms is what is called an extrapolation. Let me explain extrapolation for a moment. Supposing you have a map of Kansas, and you want, from the evidence contained in the map, to guess at what kind of territory lies beyond its edges. Well, naturally, you will extend those straight line roads. off and off and off. That's the only basis you've got to go on. Nothing in the map of Kansas would warn you that a little way west you will encounter the Rocky Mountains, and that the roads will have to wiggle. And still less will warn you that you're going to encounter the Pacific Ocean way out beyond, where you can't build any roads. So naturally, you see, extrapolation, we extrapolate from what we know to the unknown. So one might say then, is the existence of a universe before there were any living organisms an extrapolation? All we are saying is this is how things would have been if we had been around. But we weren't, so it wasn't. That is a possible argument. Although in the climate of opinion today, it is one that is not fashionable. You must watch out above all for fashion in philosophy, fashion in science. There are completely irrational functions that govern what is or what is not a respectable scientific opinion. And although there is very careful work done, very valuable and thoughtful experimentation, always in the background of this work, there are these irrational fashions of what is believable and what is not. Many things that we accept today were completely unbelievable. We are always coming across this. Authoritative pronouncements that no one will ever reach the moon because of uncontrovertible evidence about this, that, and the other. But nowadays, we have swung over perhaps to be a little bit too uncritical. And as Norbert Wiener warned in his book, The Human Use of Human Beings, we must not take science as a sort of fairy godmother. Say, well, we have all these problems of overpopulation and lack of water and so on, but science will solve it, don't worry. See, that's the other extreme. But there are these fashions. So the idea that the world is in some way, you see, therefore, one moment you let this little idealism thing under the door, and I remind you, I'm using idealism not in a moral sense, but in a metaphysical sense, as opposed to some sort of materialism. Now, the moment you let that in under the door, if I can possibly realize that the way the world is evoked by the structure of my organism, it is that way. All mountains and suns and moons and stars are the inhabitants of a strictly human world. Perhaps insects, with their different sense organs, have a very different universe, and that is an insect universe. This is, again, it seems to be a recrudescence of what used to be called the pathetic fallacy, which was the attribution of human qualities and emotions to natural phenomena. The wind sighs in the trees. My heart is sad. And somebody comes along and says, it isn't the wind that's sighing, it's you. True and not true. Because you wouldn't be able to sigh if there were no wind. And you sighing and wind blowing go with each other. I've invented this new word, go with, G-O-W-I-T-H, or goes with. It is to replace the idea of causality. Certain things go with each other, and sighing wind goes with a same world in which there are human hearts and human emotions. And if there were not a world with human hearts and emotions, there would be no wind, and if there were no wind, air, there would be no human hearts and emotions. It's a transaction, it's reciprocity. So, in the same way, every event, then, in the external world is as dependent on the observer for its happening as, for example, is a rainbow. You can say the sun is shining and there's moisture in the atmosphere. The sun, being at the right angle to the moisture, makes a rainbow. And if somebody is there, they see the rainbow. That is a mythology, a way of putting things that is acceptable to us in the current climate of philosophical and scientific fashion. But I want to put it in another way. The sun is shining, and there is a person standing. If there were moisture in the atmosphere, there would be a rainbow. But there isn't. So there is no rainbow. If you want to be fair, there is no rainbow if nobody is watching it, you see? Because you must have one of the three components, sun, moisture, observer, to have the thing called rainbow. And what applies to the tenuous, filmy, luminescent rainbow applies equally well to the hardest rocks, the solidest mountains, and the hottest fires. Because all existence is a relationship. It's like the skin of the drum. If it's not there, it will no amount of hitting a non-existent skin will produce any noise. So you see, energy is, we can see this. Energy is relationship. We can see the falling fist and the skin of the drum, boing, like that. And if there isn't both the falling fist and the skin, no noise, no existence. But existence is not only the impact of rocks upon each other. Existence requires, always as its third, you can get the rocks knocking, the sun and the moisture, the tree crashing to the ground, the sun pouring out electrical energy. But none of these things constitute existence until related with the neurological complex. Then you have to look backwards and say at the same time, the neurological complex belongs to the same world as the sun. It's a physical pattern, physical behavior, physical energy. But it takes this complexity of pattern to evoke the world. See, this idea is unfamiliar. And that's the difficulty of understanding it, that's all. It's a very simple idea. But it's an unfamiliar one, and it's an unfashionable one. Although, as I say, this sort of thinking is coming back to us at this time, very largely as a result of people's experiments with psychedelics, where one gets the perfectly uncanny feeling of the world and oneself as simply two phases of a single process. Well, as the rainbow metaphor illustrated, we arbitrarily favor an explanation of the triangle, the impact of energies in the external world, and an observer of this impact, which, as it were, energizes or realizes them, makes them real. The difficulty that we have in our prejudice that it's the two forces out there that are real, and the observer is irrelevant to the reality of the situation. That's what we're really saying. It goes back to the whole notion that man himself is irrelevant. Man is conceived as something, therefore, that is irrelevant in various ways. He could be said to be irrelevant because he is a spiritual visitor from another world altogether. He could be said to be irrelevant because he's unimportant. He makes very little difference to the total universe. He's very small. But when you get this kind of thinking, you want to go back and ask, why do people want to believe that man is irrelevant? What in all theory of this kind, look for some ask the question, what do these people want to achieve by their theory, by holding this stance? And it was fashionable in the 19th century to look upon man as irrelevant. For some very sound political reasons. I may sound a little bit like a Marxist in saying this, but it's when you're on the rampage, you have to believe either that you're the representative of God Almighty and doing everything at His bidding, or that what you're doing isn't really very important. Either position will give you an alibi for behaving like a barbarian. So the great put down on man, that our little affairs are of no concern to God. Thank heaven He's not watching anymore. And we can get away with murder, which is what we wanted to do in the colonization doings, especially of the 19th century, and the outrages of the 2 world wars. There is no God watching anymore. You know, teacher has gone out, boys, let's raise hell. That was a way of getting rid of teacher. You know, God is dead, let's have a drink. And as a result of this, you see, it became so fashionable to think of man as a merely unimportant little victim of the cosmic trap, that for a while Western man lost his sense of the dependence of what the Hebrews used to call, he lost his sense of man's position as the head of nature. And when you hear today people's comments on that old myth of man as the head of nature, they come back in a very funny way. They say, oh, that's the most conceited point of view. Man is part of nature. Yes, but why is it that the naturalists who think that man is part of nature are always fighting nature? Because they don't understand what it means to be the head of nature. Every creature is the head of nature in its turn. And we all take turns, because it's taking turns that makes the world go round. Every creature in its turn is the head of nature, because each creature creates the world in its own image. And so each creature as a creator of the world is man. Man simply means the middle position. This is the whole idea of man. The middle way, the mean. And so wherever is the central point, that is the point called man, just as you are the center of your universe. And as the astrologers explained, that when you wanted to draw the map of the soul, you took the center point occupied by the individual organism. In other words, a date and a time. That gave you a latitude and a longitude. So in relation to that date and time, how was the universe arranged shows the map of the individual soul. Because the individual is the whole universe considered from this point of view, or focused at this point of view. So, in like way, the cosmic situation of a bee or a mouse puts that mouse in the position of man when the mouse is considered the center of the universe. Now, every point in a curved space-time continuum is the center of the universe. You can see it, although this is only a metaphor and is not quite the right mathematical and physical description. But when you consider the surface of a ball, of a sphere, any point on that surface can be the center. Just rotate it to what appears to be the front as you look at it, and it's the center of the surface of the sphere. Any point. So in that kind of, if our space is curved like the surface of a sphere, then any point on it may legitimately be considered the center. And so, considered as the center, that is the point called man. Although, as I say, it may be mouse, it may be ant, it may be insect, anything. But this becomes inconceivable and unimaginable to individuals who have no experience of themselves as center. And people who insist on the idea of being an objective observer, of standing outside and watching the individual, the world as a kind of television screen or movie screen upon which there is a distant panorama of passing events. That person, by adopting that position, has excluded himself from the feeling of centrality. In fact, he rather looks down on the feeling of centrality. He says that is the egotistic situation. You think you're the center of everything. But you know, you may call it all sorts of bad names. You may call it the egocentric predicament, but that's the way it is. And it's much less egocentric to accept it than to say, well, I'll go off and play my own eccentric game as an objective observer who is a sort of controller outside the world in that qualitative sense in which the monotheistic God is said to be outside the world.